Hello.
Before we jump into these stories, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is. This helps YouTube keep sending you more content like this. Story 1: The Vanishing Man of the North Slope. Engaging in labor within Alaska's vast North Slope energy extraction sites is not a vocation universally suited for all individuals. The profound sense of isolation gradually takes its toll on one's psyche after an extended period, with nothing but white tundra and an enduring frozen darkness stretching for many months consecutively. The narrator had been actively involved in pipeline upkeep operations in the vicinity of Prudhoe Bay for approximately 6 years when this particular incident transpired in February of 2018. The remuneration for this work was substantial, indeed very generous, which served as the primary motivation for individuals like the narrator, Brad, and Tommy to return for each successive operational period. They constituted a closely knit team, consistently safeguarding one another through severe blizzards and critical equipment malfunctions that possessed the potential to be fatal with greater speed than one could even transmit a distress signal via radio. During that specific work rotation, the crew had just concluded a week-long repair assignment on a particular segment of pipe which had developed stress fractures resulting from the relentless cycles of freezing and thawing. Arctic Hydrocarbon Corporation, the employing entity, had accommodated them in one of its prefabricated shelters situated approximately 40 miles south of Dead Horse, directly adjacent to the Dalton Highway. This particular route is recognized as the ice road, frequently utilized by truck drivers. The journey back to their primary location should have been entirely unremarkable. They had successfully traversed this route innumerable times previously in Brad's specially modified Ford F-350, a vehicle equipped with chains on all 4 tires and sufficient heating capacity to prevent anyone from succumbing to the cold and transforming into an ice block. Tommy was comfortably spread across the back seat, catching up on much-needed sleep, while the narrator occupied the passenger seat, keeping Brad company as he skillfully navigated through what was quickly intensifying into a significant snowstorm. The visibility was drastically limited, perhaps reaching only 30 feet on an exceptionally clear stretch of road. The vehicle's headlights simply diffused off the swirling snow, creating a mesmerizing, almost hypnotic tunnel of white that evoked the sensation of rapid movement through an expansive, empty space. Approximately 2 hours into their drive, Brad abruptly engaged the brakes with such force that it caused Tommy to be propelled into the back of the narrator's seat, seemingly heading straight through the windshield. Barely discernible amidst the intense storm was a figure struggling along the side of the road. There was no vehicle visible nearby, nor were there any emergency lights activated. It was simply this individual, seemingly clad in a heavy parka, moving with that characteristic desperate and uncoordinated gait often observed in individuals experiencing the onset of hypothermia. Brad promptly pulled the vehicle over, as it is a fundamental unwritten rule in such environments that one simply does not abandon anyone in such extreme weather conditions, especially when the temperature is 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit and steadily worsening. Tommy jolted awake, initially expressing annoyance about the sudden halt, but quickly fell silent upon observing the scene that held their attention. The 3 of them remained seated for roughly 5 seconds, observing this individual's arduous struggle through knee-deep snow approximately 20 yards ahead. The stranger's parka appeared to be an older military surplus garment, colored olive green with a fur trim around the hood that continuously whipped around violently in the strong wind. What immediately struck the narrator as peculiar was the man's manner of walking. It was not the unsteady, stumbling gait of someone actively battling the intense cold, but rather a mechanical, repetitive motion, as if he were meticulously following a path discernible only to him. Brad sounded the horn twice, yet the man did not even turn his head, merely continuing to advance. One foot after the other, his arms hanging loosely at his sides. "Jesus Christ, he's going to die out there," Tommy exclaimed, already reaching for the door handle of the truck. Brad then shifted the truck into park, and all three of them disembarked, the wind assailing them like a torrent of 1,000 small knives. Even with their substantial protective gear, the relentless cold seemed to attempt to infiltrate every opening, every zippered seam. They began to jog toward the individual, calling out to him, their voices being utterly consumed by the ferocity of the storm. When they had approached within 10 feet, Brad grasped the man's shoulder with the intention of turning him around. It was at this precise moment that circumstances took a bizarre turn. The man's face was notably pale, indeed, it was a paper-white complexion, yet it did not exhibit the characteristic signs of frostbite. His eyes were a peculiar cloudy gray hue, reminiscent of dirty ice, and they appeared to gaze directly through them, as if seeing something beyond. He had approximately 3 days' worth of stubble, appearing dark in stark contrast to his unnaturally white skin. Furthermore, his lips were in constant motion, forming words that were inaudible amidst the wind. However, it was the scar that caused Brad to instinctively take a step back, a jagged line extending from his left temple down to his jaw. It was the kind of indelible mark that strongly suggests an individual has endured something they should, by all accounts, not have survived. "Sir, are you okay?" Tommy shouted, waving his hand directly in front of the man's face, but there was no discernible response. The individual simply stood there, swaying ever so slightly. His cloudy eyes remained fixed upon something beyond their perception, beyond the storm, beyond everything tangible. His lips never ceased their incessant movement. And when the narrator leaned in closer, resisting every primal instinct that urged him to retreat, he could just discern the phrase the man was reiterating, 247,247,247, repeated tirelessly like a malfunctioning recording device. Brad and Tommy exchanged uneasy glances. All of them had encountered narratives concerning individuals experiencing mental deterioration due to the profound isolation in this remote region, yet this situation felt distinctly different, unsettling them on a profound level the narrator found inexplicable. Despite the profound unease, they were compelled to get him into the truck. Setting aside ethical considerations, leaving him behind would inevitably lead to the cumbersome task of explaining a frozen corpse to the state troopers, a bureaucratic burden none of them wished to undertake. It required the combined effort of all three men to guide him towards the ford. He offered no resistance, yet he provided no assistance either, simply allowing them to manipulate him like a mannequin. His body remained stiff and cold even through the thick parka. The most peculiar observation was his complete lack of shivering. Anyone who has spent a significant amount of time in the Arctic understands that shivering represents the body's ultimate defensive mechanism against the cold. When that ceases, one is in dire peril. Yet, this individual's skin was ice cold, and he exhibited no shivering whatsoever. They managed to place him in the back seat with Tommy, who immediately pressed himself against the far door as if attempting to pass through it. Brad then maximized the vehicle's heating system and maneuvered back onto the Dalton Highway. For approximately 10 minutes, an eerie silence pervaded the vehicle, broken only by the full-blast heater fan and the continuous movement of those lips, still forming the same series of numbers. Then Tommy cleared his throat and articulated the unspoken thought shared by all of them. "Guys, doesn't he resemble that missing snowmobiler from a couple of years ago?" He was referring to the case where the sled had been located, but the body had never been recovered. Brad's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel. The narrator recalled that particular story. Indeed, everyone who had worked on the slope was familiar with it. It was February 2016 when a local individual named Christopher Vaughn vanished during a solitary snowmobile excursion. His sled had been discovered wrapped around a tree approximately 15 miles from the exact location where they had just picked up their unusual passenger. Blood was found on the seat, and drag marks led into the surrounding woods before abruptly ceasing. Search teams diligently looked for 2 weeks before finally abandoning the efforts. In such severe cold, without adequate shelter, an individual typically has only a few hours of survival time. He had been officially declared deceased, and a memorial service had even been conducted. His brother, who was employed by one of the subterranean extraction ventures, used to frequent the same bar in Dead Horse and had mentioned that Christopher possessed that exact scar, sustained from a childhood mishap involving a boat propeller. The more the narrator observed their silent passenger in the rearview mirror, the more his stomach churned with dread. It was the same scar, the same facial structure, even the same eye color, although Christopher's eyes had been described as brown in photographs, not this unsettling milky gray. The shelter materialized through the snowstorm like a metallic oasis, its yellow lights barely able to penetrate the thick, white wall of snow. They attempted to radio ahead, but received nothing but static, which was not uncommon in such extreme weather conditions. The building itself was one of those modular units that Polar Petroleum Group disperses along the pipeline route. Essentially, it was a reinforced shipping container equipped with bunks, a kitchenette, and a communication setup. Brad positioned the truck as close to the door as possible, and they began preparations to transport their passenger inside. It was at this moment that the man spoke for the very first time, his voice a gravelly, distorted sound, like someone speaking from underwater. "Can't go in. Not yet. Not until 2:47, he uttered. Tommy reacted with a visible jump, striking his head on the door frame. However, regardless of the stranger's wishes, they were not going to leave anyone in the truck to succumb to the cold. It required Brad to physically bear hug him from behind while Tommy and the narrator each took an arm, but they eventually managed to maneuver him through the doorway. The instant they crossed the threshold, he became completely limp, a dead weight that almost sent all of them to the floor. They gently laid him on one of the bottom bunks, and Brad proceeded to check the radio while Tommy began preparing water for coffee. The narrator remained with their guest, checking his pulse, which was slow but steady, and endeavoring to comprehend the nature of their discovery. Up close, illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights, additional details became strikingly apparent. His fingernails were unusually long, curved, and yellowish, suggesting they had not been trimmed in months. Curiously, there was no discernible odor, which troubled the narrator more than it perhaps should have. Someone who had been wandering in the wilderness should emit the scent of sweat, body odor, or something similar, but there was nothing. Just a neutral, almost sterile absence of scent. His parka pockets were empty save for a single item that caused a tightening sensation in the narrator's chest, a snowmobile key attached to a leather fob, precisely the kind sold at the Tundra Stop and Shop. The leather was cracked and weathered, and branded into it were the letters, C. Vaughn 2015. Tommy returned with the coffee and observed the narrator holding the key. His face drained of color, and he set the mugs down with such force that coffee sloshed everywhere. "That's not possible," he whispered, yet both of them knew, unequivocally, that it was right there in the narrator's hand. Brad reappeared from the radio room, shaking his head. The storm was severely interfering with all communications. They were stranded until it subsided, likely another 8 to 10 hours. It was at this point that the power briefly flickered, just once, but enough to cause all three of them to instinctively look up at the ceiling. These shelters were equipped with backup generators that activated automatically, making power interruptions a rare occurrence. The light stabilized, but a subtle change had permeated the room. Their passengers' eyes were now open, staring directly at the clock on the wall, which displayed 11:30 p.m. His lips recommenced their movement, faster this time, repeating the same mantra, 2:47. Tommy forcefully grabbed the narrator's arm, hard enough to leave a bruise. "We need to get out of here," he declared, "right now, storm or no storm." But Brad was already shaking his head, pointing towards the window where the snow was descending so densely that the truck, parked a mere 10 feet away, was completely obscured from view. They were undeniably trapped, and deep within the narrator's primal, lizard brain, he had the chilling sensation that this was precisely the intended outcome. The subsequent few hours seemed to progress with the agonizing slowness of molasses. They took turns vigilantly observing their peculiar visitor while attempting to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Brad prepared sandwiches, though no one consumed them. Tommy cleaned his tools for the third time that night. The narrator incessantly checked the weather conditions outside, hoping for any indication of a break in the storm. The man never stirred from the bunk, simply lying there with his eyes immovably fixed on the clock, his lips ceaselessly moving in their endless countdown. Around 2 a.m., a wave of profound exhaustion overcame them. Tommy volunteered for the first watch, while Brad and the narrator claimed bunks on the opposite side of the room. The narrator initially believed he would be unable to sleep, but the abrupt crash of adrenaline knocked him into a deep slumber. He awoke to Tommy violently shaking him, his eyes wide with palpable panic. The clock indicated 2:46 a.m. Brad was already on his feet, standing by the door with a wrench firmly in his hand. "He's gone," Tommy gasped. He explained that he had merely looked away for a second to check the coffee pot, and upon turning back, the bunk was empty. They meticulously searched the entire 40 feet of the shelter, but there was no conceivable place for the man to conceal himself. He had simply vanished. It was then that they heard it, 3 deliberate knocks on the metal door. They were slow, measured knocks, the kind that suggest the person performing them possesses absolute certainty about their actions. The time was 2:47 a.m. The knocking recurred, this time originating from the window on the north wall, then the south window, and finally returning to the door. It seemed to circle the shelter, as if something was methodically walking around outside, testing each point of entry. Brad tightened his grip on the wrench. "That's impossible," he declared. "Nobody could survive out there without gear." However, they all tacitly acknowledged that their recent visitor had been far from ordinary. The knocking abruptly ceased at 2:48 a.m., leaving them enveloped in a silence so profound it felt like a tangible pressure in their ears. They remained frozen in that state until dawn, none of them willing to be the first to initiate movement. When the storm finally dissipated around 7 a.m., they made a discovery that sent them scrambling frantically towards the truck. There were no footprints anywhere around the shelter, none leading away from the door, none beneath the windows, absolutely nothing. The snow remained pristine and untouched. However, Tommy never reached the truck. When Brad and the narrator turned around, Tommy had simply disappeared. There was no sound, no indication of a struggle, no tracks, just empty air where he had been standing merely 2 seconds before. They tore out of the area and did not cease driving until they reached Fairbanks. They filed a missing person report, providing details about picking up the stranger, but deliberately omitted the chilling possibility that he might have been Christopher Vaughn. The state troopers located Tommy's body 3 days later, precisely 15 miles from the shelter, in the exact spot where Vaughn's snowmobile had crashed. His body was frozen solid. His lips a distinct blue, with drag marks in the snow that simply abruptly ended. Story 2: The Vigil at Mile 237 Fuel Stop. The nights at the Mile 237 pump station seemed to stretch on endlessly, each one merging into the next until the very concept of time lost all significance. The narrator had been employed there since early November, manning the counter while fierce Arctic winds relentlessly rattled the windows, and 18-wheelers rolled past like spectral figures on the Dalton Highway. The position offered adequate compensation for a college student striving to save money, and the owner, an elderly man named Eugene, refrained from asking excessive questions when the narrator required additional shifts. Most nights transpired without incident. Truckers would stop for coffee, local residents would fill their fuel tanks, and occasionally a lost tourist might appear, disoriented by the storm. The station itself was unremarkable, featuring 2 fuel pumps out front, a modest convenience store stocked with overpriced snacks, and a restroom that barely functioned when the plumbing wasn't entirely frozen. Everything irrevocably changed on the narrator's 3rd Wednesday working there. The clock had just reached 2 a.m. when the narrator observed headlights piercing through the blizzard outside. An old Chevy pickup, its blue paint job severely corroded by rust, pulled up to pump number 4 and simply stopped. The driver made no attempt to exit the vehicle, did not reach for his wallet, and did not even switch off the engine. He merely remained seated, visible only as a dark silhouette through the frost-covered windshield. After approximately 10 minutes, the narrator speculated that perhaps the driver was experiencing vehicle trouble or had fallen asleep. However, just as the narrator retrieved his jacket to investigate, the truck abruptly reversed and disappeared back into the storm. It was certainly peculiar, but in such a remote location, strange was a relative term. The narrator made a note in the log book and returned to restocking energy drinks, assuming that would be the end of the odd occurrence. The following Wednesday brought another blizzard, even more severe than the previous one. Visibility diminished to perhaps 20 feet, and the wind caused the entire building to creak like an ancient ship. Eugene had explicitly cautioned the narrator about such nights, explaining that sometimes the weather became so extreme that even experienced truckers would choose to hunker down rather than risk traversing the highway. The narrator was occupied with counting inventory in the back room, attempting to remain busy, when he heard the familiar rumble of an engine outside. The clock on the wall displayed exactly 2 a.m. Through the security monitor, the narrator observed the same blue Chevy pull up to pump 4, occupying the identical spot as before, and the driver engaged in the exact same inaction. This time, the narrator managed to obtain a superior angle on the camera, allowing for the discernment of more details. The man appeared to be wearing a heavy winter coat with the hood pulled up, and his hands were gripping the steering wheel precisely at the 10 and 2 o'clock positions. He never altered his posture, never reached for the radio, and never even seemed to breathe. The narrator allowed this to continue for 15 minutes before resolving to approach the vehicle. The precise moment the narrator stepped towards the door, keys in hand, the truck's reverse lights illuminated. By the time the narrator battled through the wind and snow to reach pump 4, nothing remained but tire tracks, which were already being rapidly erased by the storm. The entire experience left the narrator profoundly unsettled in a manner that was difficult to articulate. There was an unsettling mechanical quality about the driver's movements, or rather, lack thereof, akin to observing a video on an endless loop. The narrator spent the remainder of his shift reacting anxiously to every set of headlights that passed, but the blue Chevy did not reappear. When Eugene arrived for the morning shift, the narrator cautiously mentioned the incident, attempting to maintain a casual tone. Eugene merely shrugged and remarked, "We got all kinds out here. Especially during storm season." However, the narrator noticed that Eugene avoided making eye contact when he said this, and his fingers nervously drummed on the counter. By the third Wednesday, the narrator had thoroughly prepared himself. He had even specifically swapped shifts with Jasmine to ensure he would be present at 2 a.m., though he did not disclose his true motivation. The security system at the station, while ancient, was still functional. It was a setup from the early 2000s that recorded everything on a continuous loop, overriding footage after 7 days. The narrator had successfully figured out how to save clips to a USB drive and had one ready in his pocket. The storm that particular night was less severe, characterized by a steady snowfall rather than a full blizzard, which meant improved visibility. The narrator positioned himself behind the counter, ensuring a clear view of Pump 4, and pretended to read a magazine while he awaited the familiar event. At 1:58 a.m., he heard it, that distinctive engine rumble, growing louder as the vehicle approached from the north. The blue Chevy materialized from the darkness as if summoned, pulling into the identical spot with practiced precision. This time, the narrator was prepared with the camera controls, zooming in as closely as the outdated system allowed. What he observed caused his skin to crawl. The man in the driver's seat was not merely still, he was impossibly still. There were no discernible micro-movements from breathing, no shifting to find a more comfortable position, no fidgeting or checking mirrors. His face remained concealed beneath that heavy hood, but his hands on the steering wheel appeared unsettlingly abnormal. The skin had a grayish tint, even accounting for the poor camera quality, and the fingers seemed excessively rigid, as if they had been frozen in place. The narrator recorded everything, his pulse pounding furiously as he observed the figure sit there for precisely 10 minutes. Then, right on schedule, the reverse lights illuminated. But this time, instead of backing straight out, the truck turned slightly, and for just a single second, the driver's side was oriented directly towards the camera. The hood fell back just enough for the narrator to catch a fleeting glimpse of his face, and what he saw caused him to stumble backward into the cigarette display. The features were undeniably human, yet profoundly distorted. There were sunken eyes that reflected no light whatsoever, skin that resembled old, weathered leather, and an expression of absolute emptiness. There was no recognition, no emotion, nothing that suggested a living person was seated behind that wheel. The truck vanished into the night before the narrator could regain his composure. He spent the subsequent hour replaying the footage, attempting to convince himself that he had misinterpreted what he had seen, that the inadequate lighting and antiquated camera had played tricks on his perception. However, each subsequent viewing only served to confirm his initial impression: whoever, or whatever, was in that truck was fundamentally not right. The narrator saved multiple copies of the recording and began meticulously searching through the station's old log books, extending his search back months, then years. Eugene maintained incredibly precise records in a storage closet situated behind the break room, dusty binders filled with delivery schedules, maintenance reports, and incident logs dating back to the station's inauguration in 1987. It was then that the narrator discovered the first mention of the phenomenon, December 1993, a note detailing a customer complaint regarding an abandoned vehicle at Pump 4 during the 2 a.m. hour. The description perfectly matched: a blue Chevy pickup, with a lone male driver who never exited the vehicle. The entries appeared sporadically thereafter, always on Wednesdays, always during winter storms, and always at precisely 2 a.m. The true shock came when the narrator discovered a folder labeled "Incident Reports, Law Enforcement," tucked behind the older logs. Inside were photocopied police reports, missing person flyers, and newspaper clippings. One particular article immediately captured his attention: an entry from January 1992 concerning a local man named Walter Hicks who had disappeared during a severe blizzard. He had been driving home from his employment at or peak operations when his truck, a blue 1988 Chevy Silverado, vanished somewhere along the Dalton Highway. Search parties found no trace of him or the vehicle despite extensive efforts. The article included a photograph of Walter, and even in the grainy newspaper reproduction, the narrator recognized those sunken features. But it was the final document in the folder that compelled the narrator to drop everything and reach for his phone. Someone had conducted a search of the truck's license plate 2 years prior and attached the results. The plate belonged to Walter Hicks, and according to DMV records, it had been registered to a vehicle declared missing in January 1992, over 30 years ago. The narrator attempted to call Eugene, but his phone went straight to voicemail. The next Wednesday loomed just 2 days away, and the narrator was torn between quitting immediately or remaining to confront whatever entity continuously returned to Pump 4. Curiosity ultimately prevailed, along with a peculiar sense of obligation, as if the narrator needed to comprehend this for Walter's sake, wherever he truly was. He spent those 2 intervening days diligently researching every available piece of information regarding the disappearance. Walter had been 28 years old when he vanished, worked rotating shifts at the Crimson Canine Mining, and left behind a wife and an infant daughter. The search efforts had been significantly hindered by the blizzard that night, with visibility near zero and temperatures plummeting to 40 degrees below zero. One specific detail from the police report stood out. Walter's last radio contact with the mining camp mentioned stopping for gas, though he never specified the location. The timeline would have placed him near mile 237 around 2 a.m., precisely when the storm reached its zenith. The narrator also uncovered something else in the newspaper archives. 3 other individuals had gone missing along that particular stretch of highway over the years, all during winter storms, and all late at night. None of them were ever found. Wednesday arrived with exceptionally clear skies for once, stars distinctly visible through the station windows, and the temperature hovering around -20 degrees Fahrenheit. The narrator had initially convinced himself that perhaps the clear weather would disrupt the pattern, that whatever force brought Walter's truck back only appeared during storms. However, at 1:45 a.m., clouds unexpectedly rolled in from nowhere, bringing snow that descended in thick, heavy sheets. By 1:55 a.m., visibility had diminished to almost nothing, and the narrator knew with chilling certainty that he would come. The narrator had prepared everything: fresh batteries in his flashlight, his phone fully charged, Eugene's number on speed dial, and a baseball bat from the storage room discreetly tucked behind the counter. At precisely 2 a.m., those familiar headlights pierced through the snow. The blue Chevy rolled up to Pump 4 with that identical, almost mechanical precision, and Walter, or the entity that used to be Walter, sat behind the wheel in his eternal vigil. This time, the narrator did not hesitate. He grabbed the flashlight and the bat, took a deep breath, and stepped out into the storm. The cold struck him with the force of a physical blow, instantly stealing his breath and causing his eyes to water. Snow swirled in chaotic patterns, reducing the world to an indistinct white void broken only by the dim glow of the station lights and the low rumble of the idling truck. As the narrator approached Pump 4, battling against the fierce wind with every step, he noticed something that had not been discernible on the security cameras. The snow around the truck fell differently, forming a perfect circle where not a single flake touched the vehicle. Even more bizarrely, the windows showed no fog from breathing, no condensation from body heat. The interior of the truck appeared as cold as the air outside. The narrator reached the driver's side door, his flashlight beam illuminating that terrible face in profile. Up close, Walter's features were even more profoundly disturbing. His skin resembled old parchment, stretched tautly over bone. His eyes were open but devoid of any perception. His lips were slightly parted, as if frozen mid-word. The narrator raised his hand to knock on the window, and at that very moment, everything went catastrophically wrong. The instant his knuckles made contact with the glass, the station's power supply was completely severed. The fuel pumps went dark. The building behind him vanished into absolute blackness, and even his flashlight flickered and died. In that sudden, profound darkness, the narrator heard the truck's door creak open for the very first time. The emergency generator should have activated within seconds, yet the darkness unnervingly persisted. The narrator stumbled backward, swinging the bat blindly while desperately attempting to reactivate his flashlight with numb fingers. Then, impossibly, he perceived light emanating from within the station. It was not the harsh fluorescence, but a soft, pale glow emanating from the windows. Through the swirling snow, the narrator could discern a figure standing inside, perfectly still, facing outward. The proportions were unsettlingly wrong, too tall and too thin. However, the narrator recognized the heavy winter coat and the hollow face. Walter stood inside the locked station, on the wrong side of the front window, staring directly out at the narrator. Frost began to spread across the glass from where he stood, forming intricate patterns that crept outward like frozen veins. The truly horrifying part was that the narrator could still distinctly hear the truck idling behind him, its engine running smoothly and steadily. He turned his head just enough to confirm what he already knew: the driver's seat was empty, the door hanging open like a gaping mouth. When he looked back at the station, Walter had moved closer to the glass, near enough that the narrator could discern every detail of his ruined face. Those empty eyes were fixed on his with an intensity that caused his chest to tighten with panic. The sound that followed will forever haunt the narrator, a voice resembling wind passing through a frozen pipe, muffled by the glass, yet clear enough to be understood. "Still, looking for pump 4, it articulated. Each word emerged slowly and with great effort, accompanied by a further spreading of frost across the window until the entire storefront was obscured by a solid sheet of ice. The narrator recoiled, slipping on the snow-covered ground, the bat rendered useless in his trembling grip. Behind him, the truck's engine suddenly revved, its headlights flashing in a rhythmic pattern that seemed almost like Morse code. The pale glow inside the station began to pulse in sync with the truck's lights. And the narrator realized with growing horror that Walter was not alone inside. Shadows stirred behind him, other figures clad in winter gear, all now standing at the windows, a total of 4 of them, including Walter, precisely matching the number of missing persons the narrator had read about. All of them stared out with those same empty eyes, their mouths moving in unison to form words that were inaudible over the storm. The frost on the windows began to form distinct letters, spelled out in ice, "Help us find the way." The narrator ran, not back to the truck, nor towards the highway, but around the building to the employee entrance, fumbling desperately with his keys while those dead eyes tracked his every movement through every window. The door finally yielded, and the narrator burst inside, slamming it shut behind him and throwing the deadbolt. The emergency lights suddenly blazed to life, revealing an entirely empty store. There were no figures at the windows, no frost on the glass. Everything appeared normal save for the thunderous pounding of his own heart. However, the truck was undeniably still outside. The narrator could hear it idling steadily at pump 4. With trembling fingers, he called 911, babbling about intruders and power outages, anything to summon outside assistance. While waiting, he retrieved the USB drive containing the footage and tucked it securely into his pocket. Then, he noticed something that turned his stomach. The clock on the wall displayed 2:47 a.m., yet according to his phone, only 10 minutes had elapsed since the power outage. The responding officer found nothing, no truck, no footprints save for the narrator's own, no frost damage to the windows. The following morning, the narrator submitted his resignation to Eugene, packed his belongings, and departed Alaska entirely. But sometimes, on cold winter nights when the snow falls heavily, he still dreams about Pump 4 and those chilling words traced in ice. He never discovered what they were seeking, and frankly, he hopes he never does. Story 3: The Cryptic Hunt in the Copper River Basin. October 2019 marked a significant turning point in the relationship between the narrator and his father. They had meticulously planned a moose hunt in Alaska's Copper River Basin for several months. It was intended to be their first genuine father-son excursion since the narrator had relocated to Seattle for his professional career 3 years prior. The narrator, 28 years old, worked in consulting and had frankly not spent more than a weekend with his father since his college years. His father had been hunting in that particular region for over 2 decades, possessing an intimate knowledge of every ridge and creek as if they were natural extensions of his own backyard. They journeyed northward from Anchorage in his father's dependable Chevy Silverado, with rifles securely stowed and camping gear tightly packed. Both were genuinely enthusiastic about disconnecting from the outside world for 5 consecutive days. The plan appeared straightforward: track some moose, perhaps achieve a successful, clean shot, and simply immerse themselves in the wilderness without the constant intrusion of cell towers or work emails buzzing in their pockets. The initial day unfolded precisely as they had envisioned. They hiked approximately 6 miles from their parking spot, establishing a robust campsite near a narrow creek that traversed a valley enveloped by dense spruce and birch trees. The father exhibited his characteristic confident swagger when in the woods, pointing out animal signs, elucidating wind patterns, and recounting tales of previous hunts in the area. The weather was crisp but not harsh, with temperatures around 35 degrees Fahrenheit, clear skies, and that ideal autumn light filtering through the trees. They erected their tent, meticulously organized their equipment, and spent the evening strategizing their route for the following morning while sharing a thermos of coffee, discreetly fortified with whiskey. Everything felt normal, even profoundly peaceful. Both were fatigued from the hike, conversing quietly about family matters, professional pressures, and life in general. Neither of them had any inkling that they were already under surveillance. The peculiar occurrences commenced on day 2. They had been hiking for approximately 3 hours, following a game trail that ascended through a series of rocky outcrops, when the father abruptly halted in his tracks. He was intently staring at something approximately 30 yards ahead, his expression transitioning from casual interest to genuine confusion. When the narrator caught up to him, he observed what had captured his father's attention: scattered remnants of what had once been a caribou, yet unlike any kill he had ever witnessed. The bones were picked entirely clean, almost with surgical precision. However, the most bizarre aspect was the arrangement of the pieces. They were not merely randomly dispersed, as would be typical of a normal predator's kill. Instead, they formed a peculiar pattern, almost as if they had been deliberately placed in a rough circle around a flat boulder. The caribou's skull rested precisely in the center, its empty eye sockets gazing up at the gray sky, and the larger bones radiated outward like the spokes of a wheel. The father knelt beside the remains, his fingers tracing the clean edges of the bones. He had been hunting for over 20 years, having witnessed numerous bear kills, wolf pack feedings, and even mountain lion attacks, but this was undeniably different. The bones were too clean, too organized, and there was not a single track anywhere in the soft earth surrounding the site, not even a partial paw print or scuff mark. "Kevin," he quietly addressed his son by his full name, a practice he reserved for moments of serious concern. "I've never seen anything like this. Whatever did this, it's big enough to take down a full-grown caribou, but smart enough to not leave any evidence behind." They spent another 10 minutes meticulously examining the area, circling wider and wider, but found absolutely nothing. There was no fur, no blood trail, and no disturbance in the surrounding vegetation. It was as if the animal had simply materialized, arranged these bones with surgical precision, and then vanished into thin air. They attempted to dismiss the incident and resumed their hunt, but the discovery had undeniably rattled both of them. The father repeatedly glanced back towards the bone site, and the narrator found himself scanning the tree line more frequently than usual. Approximately 2 miles further along the trail, they discovered another kill. This time, it was a ptarmigan, but again, the remains were arranged in that same unnatural pattern. The small bones formed a perfect miniature circle around a smooth river stone, with the tiny skull positioned exactly in the center. What made it even more disturbing was that ptarmigans are ground birds, easy prey for foxes or hawks, yet there were no feathers scattered around, no signs of a struggle, nothing to indicate a normal predator-prey encounter. The father picked up one of the delicate wing bones and held it up to the light, demonstrating how cleanly it had been stripped of meat. "This is surgical work," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "No animal does this kind of precision cleaning naturally." The pattern continued throughout the entire day. They discovered 5 additional kill sites, each one more profoundly unsettling than the last. A ground squirrel's remains were arranged around a piece of quartz, and a marten's bones formed a perfect circle around a flat piece of shale. Each site was immaculate, almost sterile, exhibiting that same eerie precision that caused the hair on the narrator's arm to stand erect. What truly distressed him was the escalation. The kills were becoming progressively fresher as they ventured deeper into the basin. The initial caribou remains had been there for days, possibly weeks, but the most recent sites still carried the metallic scent of recent death clinging to them. The father began walking differently, keeping his rifle ready, and constantly checking behind them. Neither of them wished to acknowledge it aloud, but they both instinctively knew that something was actively tracking their movements, consistently remaining just far enough ahead to meticulously prepare these grotesque displays for them to discover. It felt as though they were being deliberately led deeper into its territory, following a trail of increasingly fresh kills that served as both a warning and an invitation. That night, they established their camp in a small clearing encircled by thick spruce trees. Both were too agitated and on edge to venture further. The father insisted that they maintain the fire throughout the entire night, taking turns on watch, a practice they had never previously adopted on their camping trips. The narrator assumed the first shift, sitting with his back against a fallen log, his rifle resting across his lap, intently listening to every crack of branches and rustle of leaves in the profound darkness beyond the reach of their firelight. Around 2 a.m., during his father's watch, the narrator awoke to the sound of his father urgently whispering his name. When he opened his eyes, his father was pointing towards the opposite side of the clearing, his face starkly pale in the flickering orange glow. "There," he breathed, indicating the space between two large spruces. "Don't move too fast, but tell me what you see." The narrator slowly turned his head, following his father's gaze, and that was when he saw them. Two enormous yellow eyes reflecting their firelight, positioned approximately 8 feet off the ground, completely motionless. They were not the typical green eye shine expected from a deer or moose, but an intense, almost golden color that seemed to pulse with an uncanny intelligence. The eyes watched them for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 15 minutes. They never blinked, never shifted position, simply maintained that steady, calculating stare that caused the narrator's skin to crawl. His father had his rifle aimed at the spot, but neither of them could discern any body shape or outline in the darkness behind those eyes. Whatever entity was observing them was undeniably massive. The eye placement alone suggested something significantly larger than any wolf or bear the narrator had ever encountered. The most astonishing aspect was its absolute silence. There were no breathing sounds, no rustling of vegetation, no shifting of weight from one foot to another, just those unblinking eyes studying them with what felt like predatory patience. When dawn finally began to break and the first gray light started filtering through the trees, the eyes simply vanished. One moment they were present, the next they were gone, as if they had never existed at all. They thoroughly searched the area once there was sufficient light, but found no tracks, no disturbed vegetation, and no physical evidence that anything had been there. Day 3 altered everything. They had been hiking for approximately 4 hours, both of them jumpy and utterly exhausted from the sleepless night, when they reached the ridge line overlooking the main valley. The father was using his binoculars to scan for moose signs when he suddenly became completely rigid. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, handing the binoculars to the narrator with shaking fingers, "tell me I'm not losing my mind." The narrator adjusted the focus and directed his gaze to where his father was pointing, and there it was, standing on the opposite ridge, perhaps 800 yards away, was the largest wolf he had ever seen. However, merely calling it a wolf does not adequately convey its appearance. This creature was enormous, easily the size of a small horse, with a massive head and shoulders that seemed disproportionately broad for any normal canine. Its fur was almost black, except for peculiar silver markings along its spine that caught the sunlight like polished metal. What caused the narrator's heart to race was its posture, completely still, facing directly towards them, as if it had been patiently waiting for them to reach that precise spot. The wolf remained there for approximately 2 minutes, simply observing them through what must have been its own incredibly acute vision. Even at that considerable distance, the narrator could feel the weighty intensity of its attention, as if it were cataloging every minute detail of their appearance and behavior. His father was fumbling with his rifle, attempting to acquire a clear shot, but the range was simply too great for any reliable accuracy. Then, without any warning or gradual movement, the wolf turned and began walking along the ridge line with a fluid, almost flowing gait that appeared unnatural. It moved like a liquid shadow, covering ground with impossible speed, while maintaining perfect balance on terrain that would challenge even the most experienced mountain climber. What terrified the narrator most was its deliberate actions. It would stop every 100 yards or so, turn back towards them, and wait just long enough for them to track its movement before continuing. It was unequivocally demonstrating its ability to outmaneuver them effortlessly, indicating that it had been controlling this entire encounter from the very beginning. That's when everything clicked into place for the narrator. The meticulously arranged bone displays, the progressively fresher kills as they moved deeper into the basin, the silent nighttime surveillance, and now this calculated exhibition of dominance. They were not hunting in its territory, instead, they were being hunted by it. This was not some random predator merely protecting its domain, this was something far more intelligent and deliberate. The wolf had been continuously shadowing them for the entirety of their trip, maintaining just enough proximity to monitor their movements while deliberately leaving those grotesque calling cards to announce its presence. His father must have arrived at the same chilling conclusion because he seized the narrator's arm and declared, "We're leaving right now. This thing has been playing with us." They packed up their gear with frantic efficiency, completely abandoning any pretense of continuing the hunt. As they commenced their descent back towards the valley, the narrator could not resist one final glance through the binoculars. The wolf was still there, now sitting like some ancient sentinel, observing their retreat with what the narrator swore looked like a distinct sense of satisfaction. The hike back to their truck consumed 6 hours of non-stop walking, with both of them constantly scanning the ridge lines and tree lines surrounding them. They spoke very little during the descent, but the narrator could discern that his father was processing the same unsettling realization that was tormenting him. That massive wolf had been orchestrating their entire experience from day one. Every kill site, every peculiar arrangement of bones, Every moment of increasing unease had been meticulously planned to guide them deeper into its domain until it was prepared to reveal itself. When they finally reached the Silverado, the father threw their gear into the truck bed with shaking hands and started the engine before the narrator had even fully closed his door. As they drove away, the narrator watched the wilderness recede in the side mirror, and he swore he could still feel those golden eyes tracking their movement. They never returned to that area, and his father sold all his hunting gear the following spring. Neither of them ever explicitly discussed what they had experienced, but the narrator knew they both understood that they had encountered something that simply should not exist, an apex predator with an intelligence that bordered on the supernatural. And they had been incredibly fortunate to escape its territory alive. Story 4: The Vanishing Caribou and Humanoids. The Caribou Migration Research Project appeared to present the ideal opportunity to advance the narrator's professional career as a wildlife biologist. After 6 years dedicated to smaller research assignments, the narrator finally had the chance to lead a team studying how climate change was disrupting traditional migration routes near the Yukon River. The assignment was confirmed in late April 2017, and within 2 weeks, the narrator was heading into the Canadian wilderness with a 5-person research team. Their task involved monitoring 43 GPS-collared caribou over 3 weeks, meticulously documenting their movements and behavioral patterns. The data they collected held the potential to influence conservation policies across the entire region, making this one of the most critically important projects the narrator had ever been involved in. The narrator distinctly recalled feeling a potent mixture of excitement and responsibility as they loaded their essential gear, thermal drones, advanced tracking equipment, and extensive camping supplies for an extended stay in genuinely remote territory. Their base camp was established at an old logging site that had been abandoned sometime in the 1980s. The location was perfectly suited for their research objectives: flat ground for equipment setup, close proximity to the river for water access, and ideally positioned directly along one of the main caribou migration corridors. However, the place possessed an unsettling atmosphere that the narrator found difficult to shake. Rusted machinery lay half-buried beneath decades of moss and fallen leaves, while rotting wooden structures slowly succumbed to the relentless encroachment of the forest. The narrator's team consisted of Dr. James Mitchell, their highly experienced project leader, Lisa Chen from the Northern Institute of Ecology's Fauna Division, and 2 graduate students named Alex and Maria. They had previously collaborated on other assignments, so an established workflow characterized their organization of the campsite, distribution of daily responsibilities, and the seamless transition into their research routine. The initial few days proceeded precisely according to their meticulous plan, with clear, consistent GPS signals continuously streaming in from all tagged animals. The work itself was methodical and inherently rewarding. Every morning, they would diligently check their tracking systems while consuming coffee around the portable camp stove, observing dozens of red dots moving across their digital maps. The caribou were following their expected routes, congregating in feeding areas during daylight hours and steadily progressing northward each night. Lisa was responsible for the thermal drone flights, capturing behavioral footage that would effectively complement their GPS data. Alex and Maria took alternating turns monitoring the radio frequencies, while Dr. Mitchell and the narrator analyzed movement patterns and meticulously updated their field notes. The weather remained stable: cool mornings, warm afternoons, and perfectly clear nights, ideal conditions for equipment operation. By day 5, they had documented some truly fascinating deviations from historical migration patterns, precisely the kind of data that would significantly enhance the value of their research. The routine was comfortable, predictable, and everything was progressing according to their carefully planned schedule. During those initial several days, the narrator began to notice subtle details about the abandoned logging site that had not been immediately apparent. There were perfectly straight cut marks on certain trees, far too precise to be natural, strongly suggesting that the loggers had utilized some form of advanced equipment for their time. The concrete foundations of demolished buildings formed geometric patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if whoever had designed the original layout possessed a specific organizational system in mind. Most intriguingly, they discovered several metal plates buried beneath decades of debris, each one stamped with sequential numbers, but lacking any company identification or dates. Dr. Mitchell commented that logging operations from that era typically left more obvious traces, such as marked trees, equipment serial numbers, or proper signage, but this place was distinctly different, almost sterile in the thoroughness with which it had been cleared of identifying information. Nevertheless, these observations did not impede their ongoing research, and they had more pressing concerns than investigating the site's mysterious past. Everything dramatically changed on the night of May 15th. The narrator was meticulously reviewing data logs in her tent around 11:30 p.m. when Alex came running from the monitoring station, his face starkly pale in the lantern light. "Heather, you need to see this right now," he declared, his voice tight with palpable concern. All 43 GPS signals had disappeared simultaneously at precisely 11:17 p.m. This cessation was not gradual, nor did it occur one by one. Instead, it happened all at once, as if someone had simply flipped a switch. The tracking system displayed no error messages, no equipment malfunctions, and no technical explanations for the sudden blackout. Lisa diligently ran diagnostics on their receivers while Dr. Mitchell meticulously checked the backup systems, but everything on their end was functioning perfectly. They spent the subsequent 3 hours attempting to re-establish contact, adjusting frequencies, boosting signal strength, and even endeavoring manual pings to individual callers. Nothing proved effective. The caribou had simply vanished from their monitoring network, leaving them staring at empty screens and pondering what on earth had just occurred. The silence that followed was unlike anything the narrator had ever experienced in the wilderness. Typically, the Canadian forest at night is alive with a symphony of sounds: owls calling, branches creaking, and small animals rustling through the undergrowth. But after the signals vanished, even those familiar noises seemed to fade away, replaced by an oppressive quiet that caused the narrator's ears to ring. They collectively decided to take shifts monitoring the equipment throughout the night, holding on to the hope that the signals might return as mysteriously as they had vanished. Dr. Mitchell undertook the first watch, followed by Lisa, then Alex. When the narrator's turn arrived at 4 a.m., she sat alone in the monitoring tent, surrounded by silent equipment and attempting to make sense of the inexplicable event. The GPS system had never failed so completely before, and the precise timing, all signals cutting out at the exact same moment, strongly suggested something far more serious than a simple technical glitch. She incessantly checked and rechecked their data logs, desperately hoping to uncover some pattern or explanation that they had overlooked. Dawn brought no relief, only more perplexing questions. They packed up quickly and headed towards the last known location of the nearest caribou herd, approximately 6 miles northeast of their camp. The hike through the dense forest was fraught with tension, everyone lost in their own thoughts about what they might discover. When they reached the designated area, there was no sign of the animals, no tracks, no droppings, no evidence that they had ever been there. However, their equipment remained undisturbed, positioned precisely where they had left it the previous day. Cameras, motion sensors, even the backup GPS units were all functioning normally, still diligently recording data from their positions. It was as if the caribou had simply evaporated, leaving behind only the technology they had utilized to monitor them. Lisa proposed expanding their search radius, but Dr. Mitchell was already expressing concern about their tight timeline and limited resources. They dedicated the entire day to searching a 12-mile area, finding nothing but empty wilderness and the growing certainty that something unprecedented had transpired. That evening, Lisa decided to review the thermal drone footage from the previous night, hoping to find some clue about what had happened to the caribou. They gathered around her laptop in the main tent, watching hours of grainy infrared video. Most of it displayed precisely what they expected: empty forest, occasional small animals moving through the underbrush, and the normal thermal signatures of a quiet wilderness night. But at 11:15 p.m., just 2 minutes before the GPS signals had vanished, the footage captured something extraordinary. 7 tall figures emerged from the tree line, moving in perfect synchronization across the open area near their camp. They were unequivocally humanoid, but unsettlingly distorted somehow, too tall, too coordinated, moving with a fluid precision that seemed almost mechanical. Their thermal signatures indicated they were warmer than the surrounding environment, but cooler than normal human body temperature. Most disturbing was the way they moved together, like a single organism with multiple parts, meticulously maintaining exact spacing and identical movements as they traversed the frame and disappeared back into the forest on the opposite side. None of them spoke for several minutes after the footage concluded. Dr. Mitchell rewound it 3 times, meticulously studying every detail, while Alex continuously muttered that the equipment must have malfunctioned. But Lisa and the narrator both instinctively knew that what they were seeing was real. The thermal imaging was too consistent, too detailed, to be dismissed as some technical glitch. The figures were approximately 8 feet tall with elongated limbs and movements that suggested an intimate familiarity with the terrain. They produced no sound that the drone's audio equipment could detect, moving across fallen logs and dense undergrowth without disturbing a single branch. What haunted the narrator most was their unparalleled coordination. It was not merely walking in formation, but actively mirroring each other's movements down to the smallest gesture. When the leading figure raised what appeared to be its arm, all 7 figures performed the identical motion simultaneously. They watched the clip dozens of times, but it only generated more questions about the nature of what they were dealing with and whether it was connected to the caribou disappearance. That night, they implemented a buddy system. No one was permitted to leave their tent alone, and they established regular check-ins every hour until dawn. Despite their precautions, the narrator barely slept, listening intently to every sound outside and wondering if those figures were still out there watching them. Around 3 a.m., the narrator heard Maria urgently whispering to Alex in the tent adjacent to hers. But when she called out to inquire if everything was all right, Maria responded that she had merely had a bad dream. The remainder of the night passed without incident, but morning brought a new horror that made the previous day's mystery seem trivial. When they gathered for breakfast at 7 a.m., Alex was missing. His sleeping bag was empty, his personal belongings were still neatly arranged beside his cot, and his boots were gone. They searched the immediate vicinity around camp, calling his name and checking all the places he might have wandered during the night. Dr. Mitchell was already discussing contacting emergency services when the narrator decided to check the riverbank, considering the possibility that Alex might have gone for water and slipped on the muddy slope. What the narrator discovered at the water's edge defied every logical explanation she could conceive. Alex's hiking boots were placed with mathematical precision on a flat rock, positioned perfectly parallel to each other and facing directly toward the flowing water. The laces were tied in neat bows, exactly as he consistently wore them, and there wasn't a single scuff mark or piece of mud on the leather. Crucially, there were no footprints, none leading to the boots, none leading away from them, nothing in the soft riverbank soil that would indicate how they had arrived there. The rock upon which they sat was completely dry, despite the morning mist that had dampened everything else in the area. The narrator summoned the others, and they spent 2 hours meticulously examining every inch of the surrounding ground, searching for any trace of Alex's passage. The absence of tracks was absolute and impossible. Even if someone had deliberately erased footprints, there would be discernible signs of the erasure itself. Yet, the boots remained there like a carefully arranged display, as if they had been placed by someone capable of moving without physically touching the ground. They immediately packed up camp and hiked back to the nearest communication point to contact the authorities. The search and rescue operation endured for 4 days, involving helicopters, tracking dogs, and highly experienced wilderness teams, but no trace of Alex was ever found. The official report listed him as missing, presumed deceased, with the working theory being that he had somehow fallen into the river and been swept away by the current. However, that explanation did not account for the inexplicable placement of the boots, which the investigators dismissed as irrelevant details. 6 months later, the narrator received a phone call from a forestry worker who had been conducting surveys in the same area. He had discovered something buried under a pile of stones near the old logging site, a GPS collar, still functional, with data indicating it had been stationary in that exact location since May 15 at 11:17 p.m. It was one of the collars from their missing caribou, and the timing perfectly matched when all the signals had disappeared. The narrator never returned to that site and has never worked another research project in that region. Some mysteries, she believes, are simply better left unsolved. Story 5: The Copper Creek Lodge Incident. Every time someone mentions Alaska, the narrator's stomach knots with a familiar dread. People typically envision the breathtaking wilderness and spectacular northern lights, but all the narrator can recall is that terrifying night at Copper Creek Lodge. At that time, the narrator was fresh out of her junior year at college, undertaking a seasonal position as a front desk clerk and maintenance helper at this minuscule, isolated lodge situated near Wrangell St. Elias National Park. It was June 2022, and the lodge essentially constituted her entire world for 3 months. The lodge comprised 12 small cabins scattered across the property, interconnected by gravel paths that produced a distinct crunch underfoot, regardless of how quietly one attempted to walk. Their nearest neighbor was a considerable 40 miles away, and cellular service was absolutely non-existent. The sole connection to the outside world was a single landline in the main office that frequently crackled with static even on favorable days. Most nights, the silence was so profound it felt as though they were the last remaining individuals on Earth. The guests that week primarily consisted of hikers and photographers, the type of individuals who specifically sought out Alaska to escape civilization. There was one particular couple, David and Amanda, who had been staying in cabin 7 for 3 days with their friend Troy. David was one of those talkative individuals who seemed to never cease speaking, constantly cracking jokes and eliciting laughter from everyone during meals in the main lodge. Amanda was more reserved and quiet, yet she possessed a unique way of observing everything around her, as if she were perpetually taking mental notes. Troy occupied an intermediate position, friendly enough but largely keeping to himself. They would spend their days hiking the trails surrounding the property and return each evening utterly exhausted, covered in mud and mosquito bites. The dynamic among them appeared normal enough, just 3 friends embarking on a wilderness adventure, but there was an underlying tension the narrator couldn't quite identify, particularly between David and Troy. The day everything went awry began like any other. The narrator had spent most of it repairing a broken water heater in cabin 3 and restocking supplies in the main lodge. The weather had been unusually warm for June, and by evening, the air was thick with mosquitoes and that peculiar twilight that never fully transitions into complete darkness during Alaskan summers. Around 9 p.m., the narrator noticed David, Amanda, and Troy heading towards the bathhouse, a small wooden building located approximately 100 yards from the main lodge. Troy was carrying a towel and seemed eager to finally get cleaned up after their long hike. David and Amanda were walking behind him, and the narrator could hear David's voice growing louder as they moved further away, although she could not discern what he was saying. There was something about his tone that made the narrator pause while locking up the office, but she ultimately shrugged it off, acknowledging that guests sometimes argued, especially when fatigued and coping with isolation. Approximately an hour later, the narrator was in her small staff cabin, reading, when she heard voices outside. Initially, she assumed it was merely other guests returning from their evening activities, but the voices were growing closer and more agitated. Then, she distinctly heard Amanda's voice, sharp and panicked, calling out something about Troy being missing. The narrator put down her book and listened more attentively. David was with her, and they were moving from cabin to cabin, knocking on doors and inquiring if anyone had seen Troy. Their voices possessed a frantic edge that caused the hair on the narrator's arms to stand up. She grabbed her flashlight and stepped outside, and that was when Amanda spotted her. Amanda came running over, her face pale even in the dim light, and David was right behind her, his eyes displaying a wild, unfamiliar look. Amanda kept reiterating that Troy had disappeared after some kind of altercation near the bathhouse. However, when the narrator requested details, both of them seemed to stumble over their words. The story they recounted kept changing each time the narrator posed a question. First, Amanda claimed Troy had gotten into an argument with a stranger who was lurking around the bathhouse. Then, David interjected, stating that the stranger had been there for hours, simply observing people coming and going. But when the narrator inquired about the stranger's appearance, Amanda described a tall man with dark hair, while David insisted he was shorter and bearded. Their descriptions were so divergent it was as if they were discussing entirely different individuals. Amanda continuously wrung her hands and anxiously looked around, while David paced back and forth, repeatedly running his fingers through his hair. The entire situation felt wrong, as if they were enacting a rehearsed panic rather than genuinely expressing concern for their friend. The narrator suggested they check the bathhouse first, thinking Troy might have simply wandered off to calm down after whatever argument had transpired. But as they walked towards the building, the narrator noticed David continuously glancing at Amanda with quick, meaningful looks that caused her skin to crawl. The bathhouse was completely empty upon their arrival, but there were clear signs of some kind of struggle. The wooden bench outside was overturned, and there were scuff marks in the dirt that suggested someone had been dragged or had fallen hard. Amanda immediately began crying, stating they needed to contact the police. However, when the narrator suggested using the landline in the main office, David quickly insisted they should search the property first, arguing that Troy had probably just gone for a walk to clear his head and would return at any moment. But the way he articulated this, with a forced calm in his voice, made the narrator realize he was attempting to control the situation. The narrator agreed to assist them in their search, but she was already planning to contact the authorities as soon as they returned to the lodge. The three of them spent the next hour meticulously combing through the trails with flashlights, calling Troy's name, and receiving no response. Every shadow seemed menacing, and every sound caused them to jump. Amanda repeatedly inquired about their next course of action, but David consistently steered the conversation away from seeking external help. When they finally abandoned the search around midnight, the narrator was exhausted and genuinely worried about Troy. She informed David and Amanda that she intended to call the state troopers from the main office. It was at this moment that David's entire demeanor drastically shifted. He grabbed the narrator's arm and insisted they should wait until morning, suggesting that Troy would probably reappear on his own, and they would merely be wasting everyone's time. But Amanda disagreed, stating they needed to inform Troy's family about the situation. The two of them began arguing directly in front of the narrator, and she could discern the desperation in both their voices. David adamantly maintained that contacting the police would only exacerbate matters, while Amanda was practically pleading with him to allow the narrator to make the call. During their argument, the narrator noticed David had scratches on his forearms that were definitely not present earlier in the day. When she inquired about them, he claimed he had sustained them while pushing through some bushes during their search. However, the scratches appeared fresh and deep, like fingernail marks, and they were in a pattern that suggested someone had been attempting to defend themselves. The narrator finally persuaded them that contacting the authorities was necessary, and the three of them walked back to the main lodge together. The building felt eerily quiet as the narrator unlocked the office door, and she could hear both David and Amanda breathing heavily behind her. When the narrator picked up the landline phone to dial, there was no dial tone, just complete silence. She jiggled the cord and checked all the connections, but the line was completely dead. David immediately claimed the phone lines had probably gone down due to the weather, but there had been no storms that day. Amanda grew increasingly agitated by the minute, pacing around the small office and muttering about how they needed to obtain help somehow. The narrator informed them that she would drive to the nearest town in the morning to report Troy missing, but David quickly volunteered to go instead. He asserted he knew the area better and could get there faster, but something about his eagerness to leave made the narrator suspicious. The narrator insisted they all remain together until they understood what had happened to Troy. It was then that she noticed David and Amanda exchanging another one of those loaded glances. They decided to wait until dawn before making any further decisions, and the narrator offered to let them stay in the main lodge instead of returning to their cabin. Amanda accepted immediately, but David seemed reluctant, stating he wanted to retrieve some of their belongings. The narrator watched him walk towards cabin 7, and something about his movements, quick and purposeful, made her decide to follow him at a distance. She grabbed her flashlight and stealthily exited the back door of the lodge, staying in the shadows as she made her way towards their cabin. David remained inside for perhaps 10 minutes. When he emerged, he was carrying a large duffel bag that appeared considerably heavier than it should have been if he was merely collecting clothes. He also had something wrapped in a towel tucked under his arm, and he continuously looked around nervously as he walked back. The narrator managed to return to the lodge before him, but she pretended to be dozing in one of the lobby chairs when he returned. Amanda was curled up on the couch, but the narrator could discern she wasn't truly sleeping either. The three of them spent the remainder of the night in that main room, and the narrator believes none of them got a minute of actual sleep. When the sun finally rose around 4:30 a.m., the narrator suggested they all walk back to the bathhouse area in the daylight to see if they could discover any additional clues about what had happened to Troy. David immediately protested, stating they had already searched thoroughly and would find nothing new. But Amanda stood up and declared she wanted to look again. After a moment of hesitation, David agreed to accompany them. As they walked towards the bathhouse, the narrator noticed David consistently positioning himself between Amanda and her, as if attempting to control what they could see or where they could go. The morning light revealed details they had missed in the dark. There were drops of what appeared to be dried liquid on the wooden steps of the bathhouse, and the ground around the building was more disturbed than the narrator had initially realized. Amanda pointed out a torn piece of fabric caught on a nearby bush. When she started to reach for it, David quickly intervened and stated, "We shouldn't touch anything that might be evidence." But the way he said it, with a forced authority in his voice, made the narrator wonder if he was trying to preserve evidence or destroy it. Around 7 a.m., the narrator heard the distant sound of a helicopter approaching, which was unusual given that air traffic rarely occurred that early in the morning. David's face turned completely white upon hearing it, and he began speaking rapidly about how they should probably return to their cabin to pack up and leave. But Amanda was staring at the helicopter with an expression combining relief and terror, and she whispered something about hoping it was help. The helicopter landed in the clearing near the main lodge, and 2 state troopers emerged along with a paramedic. The narrator's first thought was that someone else had called about Troy, but then she realized that was impossible since their phone lines were down. One of the troopers approached them and inquired if they were the individuals who had reported a missing person. Before the narrator could respond, David interjected and claimed there had been a misunderstanding. He asserted Troy had merely wandered off for a walk and had probably already returned to town on his own. The trooper appeared skeptical and requested to speak with each of them separately, beginning with Amanda. While Amanda was conversing with the officers, David continuously attempted to convince the narrator that they should tell them everything was fine and that Troy would eventually reappear. He was sweating despite the cool morning air, and he kept fidgeting with something in his pocket. But then the paramedic approached and informed them they had found Troy approximately 2 miles downstream near the old mining road. He was alive but in critical condition, having sustained multiple stab wounds, and had already been airlifted to a hospital in Fairbanks. The paramedic explained that Troy had managed to crawl to the road and flag down a passing truck driver who had called for help on his CB radio. When the narrator looked at David after hearing this news, his face had turned completely gray, and he was staring at the ground as if attempting to disappear. Amanda began crying, but they were not tears of relief, they were tears of palpable fear. The troopers arrested David that afternoon after discovering the knife wrapped in the towel he had retrieved from their cabin. Amanda confessed that she had helped him move Troy's body after the attack. She stated David had snapped during an argument concerning money Troy owed him, and they had panicked when they believed he was dead. The phone line had been deliberately cut with wire cutters found in David's bag. Amanda received a reduced sentence for her cooperation, but David was charged with attempted murder. The narrator quit her job the very next day and never returned to Alaska. Sometimes, she still awakens wondering what would have transpired if that truck driver had not found Troy in time. Story 6: The Unsettling Encounter on the Kuskokwim River. Most summers, the narrator's Uncle Tim would take him on fishing excursions to remote locations in Alaska. Tim is the type of individual who regards Wi-Fi as a governmental deception and believes that true life commences when one's boots become immersed in mud. On that particular trip, they were camped just outside Bethel along a bend in the Kuskokwim River, where the bank sloped down in a jagged array of roots and compacted silt. The narrator had just celebrated his 13th birthday that spring, and it was his inaugural experience receiving his own fishing gear, a rod, boots, and even a small fillet knife. He distinctly recalled feeling a sense of pride, as if he had finally earned a place alongside the adults, even if he still had to sleep in the smaller tent. It was early afternoon, and Tim had hiked upstream a considerable distance to inspect some traps, leaving the narrator with explicit instructions not to wander far and to maintain the fire. The sun was visible but hazy, filtered through low clouds that imparted a softer, quieter quality to everything. The narrator had positioned himself by the water with his tackle box and a half-warmed thermos of black coffee he wasn't genuinely supposed to be consuming. The current was slow that day, slowly dragging bits of moss and driftwood in wide, languid arcs, and the narrator remembered observing the water's surface as if it were a cinematic presentation. There was no phone, no distractions, just the steady hush of water and wind. Then, someone called out from the trees situated behind him. Initially, the narrator assumed it was Tim playing a prank. The voice possessed a friendly yet peculiar tone, like someone carefully attempting not to startle a stray dog. When the narrator turned, he observed a man standing halfway down the slope leading into the brush. He was wearing a camouflage jacket that appeared as though it had been thoroughly dipped in mud and neglected for years, and a wool beanie was stretched over his head, as if pulled on without checking for proper fit. The narrator did not recognize him. He was not from the campgrounds nor from the small shop they had visited in town. The man smiled, his mouth open just enough to reveal a missing canine tooth, and introduced himself as a local guide. He claimed he was transporting gear for a group of hunters and required a second pair of hands. There was something about the man's absolute stillness while he spoke that did not sit right with the narrator. His feet never shifted, and his hands remained clasped behind his back even when he gestured with his chin towards the trees. The narrator inquired which outfitter he worked for, and the man deftly dodged the question as if it were a highly sensitive inquiry, like asking for his social security number. He then emitted a dry, shallow laugh and muttered something under his breath that sounded like, "They never learn." The man proceeded to laugh, a dry, shallow sound, and then muttered something under his breath that sounded like, "They never learn." He then pointed deeper into the woods, asserting it was not far, just beyond a ridge, and stated that the narrator looked strong enough to carry a couple of crates. The narrator distinctly remembered feeling his knees tense, not with fear exactly, but as though his body had already reached a decision before his brain consciously processed it. He informed the man he needed to retrieve his boots, a clear stalling tactic, but the man stepped forward as if he hadn't heard the narrator's words. It was only a few feet, but it felt alarmingly close. His boots sank into the soft dirt near the edge of the water, leaving deep, wide prints as if he had been pacing that shoreline for an extended period. It was then that the narrator noticed the back of the man's pants were soaked up to the thighs, and not from walking through shallow river water. It was a darker, muddier stain, as if he had been kneeling somewhere wet for too long. He glanced towards the trail again, but there was no gear in sight, just thick brush and a tangled mess of alder branches snapped low, as if someone had pushed through them rapidly and recently. The narrator simply said, "No." He didn't even contemplate it, he just uttered the word aloud, firm and clear, precisely as his uncle had instructed him to speak if something ever felt wrong. The man did not respond immediately. He simply continued to stand there, staring, as if the narrator hadn't spoken at all. His face remained impassive, but his jaw clenched once, quickly. The narrator then began to back away, careful not to turn around, maintaining the river behind him as a form of perceived barrier. He felt a peculiar pressure, as if he had to continuously talk or move or engage in some action, because silence felt inherently dangerous. He walked backward until he encountered a log that marked the trail leading back to camp. It was then that the man took one more step towards him, slow and deliberate, and stated, "You don't want to be out here alone when it gets dark." It was not a direct threat, not exactly. It sounded more like a simple statement of fact. His tone was flat and strangely calm, as if he were reciting a weather report. The narrator did not respond, he simply turned and ran. He didn't check to see if the man followed, and he didn't hear any footsteps, but he also didn't trust the pervasive quiet. The trees seemed thicker on the way back, as if they were leaning in, and the narrator remembered ducking under branches that had not been low before. By the time he reached the tents, he couldn't determine if he had been gone for 10 minutes or an hour. Everything looked the same, but it all felt off balance, as if the world had been subtly nudged sideways. The narrator did not see Tim anywhere, and for a fleeting second, he panicked, thinking perhaps the man had reached his uncle too. But then he saw smoke curling up from the fire pit. Tim emerged from behind the truck a few seconds later, holding a wrench and wiping grease from his fingers. He inquired if the narrator had caught anything. The narrator replied negatively and stated that they needed to pack up early. Tim gave him a questioning look but did not argue. They departed that same afternoon. Tim did not press for details until they were halfway down the gravel road returning towards town. The narrator recounted what had transpired as straightforwardly as he could. Tim became very quiet, not angry, but intensely focused, as if he was mentally reviewing maps and faces. He inquired about the man's appearance, what he had said, and if the narrator could pinpoint the exact spot. The narrator described the soaked pants, the missing tooth, and the detail about the man keeping his hands out of view. Tim remained silent for a while after that. When they arrived in town, he made a quick stop at the ranger station while the narrator waited in the truck with the windows slightly ajar and his fishing rod still untouched in the back seat. That night, back at the motel, the news was playing in the background while they ate. The narrator was barely paying attention until Tim increased the volume. A missing persons alert had been issued for a boy named Alex, 15 years old, last seen just outside a different campsite, not far from theirs, for days earlier. There were no solid leads, but the report mentioned he was last spotted talking to someone described as a man in camouflage, possibly a local. The photo of the missing boy hit hard. He was taller than the narrator, but something about his expression felt familiar. Just a regular teenager attempting to enjoy the outdoors, likely not anticipating his afternoon to take such a dark turn. The narrator did not sleep much that night. He continuously thought about how rapidly things could have gone wrong if he had agreed, if he had followed, if he had hesitated even a second longer. He acknowledges he did nothing heroic, he merely listened to that innate part of himself that tenses up when something feels fundamentally amiss. He still sometimes thinks about that man's voice, how eerily calm it was when he told him he didn't want to be alone out there. Not angry, not frustrated, just profoundly certain, as if he wasn't guessing how things would end, he already knew. They haven't returned to that spot since. Tim said they would stick to places closer to town for a while. The narrator never saw the man again, and as far as he knows, no one was ever arrested. The other boy, Alex, was never found. His name occasionally appears in online forums, and each time it does, the narrator contemplates reporting the interaction again. But the truth is, he has already shared what he knows. And perhaps posting about it now is simply a way to remind anyone reading, trust that gut feeling, even if it doesn't immediately make logical sense, especially when it doesn't. He still doesn't know why he didn't turn around that day. Part of him believes it was simply denial, that he didn't want to admit something was profoundly wrong. Story 7. The Highway Shadow. The narrator, a mother, still doesn't comprehend why she didn't turn around that day. Part of her believes it was simply denial, a reluctance to acknowledge that something was gravely amiss. They were supposed to be heading to a wrestling tournament in Satna, just her and her son, Mason. Mason, 16 years old, was deeply involved in sports, always casually tossing his gym bag into the back seat as if he commanded the world. The narrator had taken the weekend off from her work at Alpine Dental Care, packed both of them up, filled the fuel tank at a Summit Gas near Kenny Spur Road, and anticipated making good time before sunset. The drive south from their town was familiar to her. They had traversed it twice previously for other school events. She remembered telling herself it would be a quiet journey, perhaps even an opportunity for them to engage in conversation without distractions. They were approximately 30 minutes south of Sterling when the narrator first observed the pickup truck. It featured dark-tinted windows and an older matte gray paint job, nothing ostentatious, just enough to blend in. It merged into her lane behind them somewhere past the last gas station. Initially, the narrator did not give it much thought. The highway is long and mostly deserted, and vehicles sometimes travel together for miles. However, this particular truck remained uncomfortably close, excessively so. The narrator checked her rearview mirror more than once, expecting it to overtake them, but it never did. She even nudged her car over to the right shoulder, slowing down sufficiently to invite the truck to pass. Instead, the driver precisely matched her speed, maintaining the same tight distance, almost as if he were tethered to their vehicle. The narrator pointed it out to Mason, attempting to conceal her nervousness. He was preoccupied with his phone but glanced up and muttered something like, "Creeper vibes." He was not mistaken. The narrator tested the truck again. She accelerated slightly, then reduced her speed to below the legal limit. The truck mirrored every maneuver. She tapped the brakes twice, a tactic her father used to caution tailgaters. No change. She switched lanes without any specific reason. The truck remained directly behind them. The behavior was not aggressive, but undeniably deliberate. That, paradoxically, made it worse. There was no honking, no flashing lights, no engine revving, just that constant pressure behind them, as if they were being systematically herded somewhere. The narrator did not want to panic in front of Mason, but a cold realization began to dawn upon her. this was not merely someone zoning out on the highway. It was too late to turn back, and the cell signal was weak in that particular stretch of road. She instructed Mason to open the Maps application and search for the nearest illuminated place to pull over, perhaps a store or a rest area. They located a rest stop approximately 10 minutes ahead. It was barely marked on the map, just a faded icon, but it was preferable to remaining in motion with this individual glued to their bumper. The narrator remained calm, or at least she tried to. Her knuckles were beginning to ache from the intensity with which she gripped the steering wheel. The rest stop was not what she had hoped for. It was a gravel pull-off featuring a single flickering street lamp, a rusted vending machine that likely hadn't functioned since the early 2000s, and an unmarked porta-potty tilted slightly in the mud. There were no other cars, no other people, just the wind rustling through the trees and the dull hum of the nearby river. The narrator slowed down and pulled in regardless, thinking that if the truck passed them, she would simply wait a few minutes before rejoining the road. But it did not pass. It followed them in, slowly, steadily, and with unsettling confidence. The narrator felt Mason sit up straight. She could tell he was attempting to appear unfazed, but she observed the way he held his breath. The truck did not park next to them. Instead, it angled itself behind her car, effectively cutting off the exit as if the maneuver had been rehearsed. The narrator could not precisely recognize the model, an older Chevy or GMC, perhaps late 1990s, but there was something peculiar about the front grille. It appeared homemade, reinforced, as if someone had welded extra bars across it. Her headlights reflected off the tinted windshield, but she could not discern anything inside. There was no movement, no door opening, just the truck sitting there, engine still running, its low idle rumbling through the quiet like a distinct warning. The narrator instructed Mason, "Don't get out," and retrieved her phone, only to find no signal. Mason whispered that he was already recording. He had flipped his camera around and angled it low against the dashboard, barely moving his hand. The narrator didn't even have to ask, he simply did it. A smart kid. She told him to continue filming no matter what. The narrator was about to honk just once, perhaps to scare whoever it was or to alert someone nearby, even though she doubted anyone would hear. But before she could, the driver's side door of the truck cracked open, not all the way, just a few inches. Then it shut again. Nothing else happened, no one emerged. The narrator could not explain the action, but it felt calculated, as if they were letting them know they were being observed, being evaluated. That was the moment it ceased feeling like paranoia and began to feel undeniably like a trap. The narrator did not want to reverse into them, but they were effectively boxed in. There was a steep ditch to the right and dense trees on the left. She kept contemplating that if she drove forward over the grass, she might get stuck. So, she simply remained there, engine running, doors locked. The truck crept forward an inch, just one, and the narrator could not restrain herself. She yelled, "What the hell do you want?" Mason grabbed her arm, attempting to calm her down, and whispered, "Mom, wait." The driver still did not move, just that engine humming as if it possessed all the time in the world. Out of pure instinct, the narrator leaned on the horn, a long and loud blast. It echoed across the trees and the empty highway beyond. That finally prompted a reaction. The truck jolted backward, then reversed rapidly, kicking up gravel behind it. It did not exit the lot entirely. It stopped again by the exit, half-turned towards the road, as if the driver was undecided whether to flee or wait. The narrator put her car in drive, aimed directly at the ditch, and floored it. The wheels bounced hard over the edge, the undercarriage scraped, but they successfully navigated through the muddy patch and onto the far side of the rest stop. The narrator did not look back until she was on the highway again. When she checked the mirror, the truck was gone, not on the road behind them, not in the lot, simply vanished. Mason ceased recording, and they drove the next 20 minutes in profound silence until they reached a more populated area where the narrator could finally breathe again. She pulled into a busy grocery store parking lot and made Mason send the video to her email, just in case. They remained there for a while before the narrator finally called the police. She did not even care if they thought she was being dramatic. She knew what they had just experienced was not normal. It was not road rage, it was not a prank. It was something far darker. The trooper who met them took the report seriously. The narrator showed him the footage, and he actually recognized the truck immediately. He did not provide the full story, but he stated that the driver matched the description of an individual they had been attempting to locate for months, connected to at least 3 other roadside harassment reports along the Kenai Peninsula. These incidents always occurred late afternoons, always targeting women driving alone or with children. Nothing had escalated to physical violence, but the behavior was undeniably escalating. He stated that Mason's video was the clearest evidence they had obtained thus far, and that it might finally provide them with what they needed to make an arrest. They never received follow-up information about what transpired after that, likely for legal reasons. But the narrator has never driven that stretch of highway again without someone in the passenger seat and a full tank of fuel. Mason also ceased asking for solo drives. He still jokes that he saved the day with his camera, and perhaps he is right. That small bit of instinct might have prevented them from becoming another unsolved case. The narrator just hopes whoever was behind that wheel, whoever considered that kind of behavior a game, realized they chose the wrong car that night.
Bye.